So again, I'm Jan Santerre. I'm the Project Canopy Coordinator with the Maine Forest Service, and I've been in this position for the last 12 or 13 years, and I've been with the program for about 20 years. So I've been involved with the grants management for some time now, and pretty adept at management of the grants. So hopefully we can succinctly walk you through this program. So on our agenda today, we are not going to do major introductions for those participants, but just for our team here at the Forest Service. I'm going to do just a brief overview of Project Canopy, what the program is. I'm then going to do an overview of the 2 different grant programs that you can apply to. And then we're going to switch over to Marlene LaJoy. She's our grants administrator at the Maine Forest Service, and she's going to go over the grant rules of the road, which is fairly in-depth into the management of federal grants. If you haven't managed a federal grant before as a recipient, there's definitely some strings attached, and we just want to make sure that you all are aware of what those strings are before you get involved. And then we will take any time that you have for questions, and you can feel free to unmute your lines at that point. If you have questions as we're moving through and you want to ask that in the chat, we've got folks here that can help to answer those, or we can catalog those and get back to you with answers as well. So for introductions, Kim, Marlene, and Greg, if you want to just take a quick moment to introduce yourselves, that would be super.
Yeah, hi folks, this is Kim Ballard, Outreach Director for Project Canopy. I handle a lot of the communications as well as trainings and education. So I'm glad you're all here, and I'm looking forward to seeing your proposals.
I'm Greg Lord with the Maine Forest Service, and just here for supporting Project Canopy and sort of the background with technical stuff, updating the website and things like that. So hope you all enjoy the day. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marlene LaJoy, the Resource Administrator for the Maine Forest Service. I've been with the Maine Forest Service for the last 5 years or so, and have been working with grants for probably almost my whole time in state government, which is maybe 28 years now. So anyway, and I also handle a lot of the payments and contracts and anything else associated with grants. So looking forward to covering this information, even though it might be a little dry. And if there's any questions after or as you proceed in your grant application, always happy to help out and answer those. Thanks.
Thanks, Marlene. I poke at this program as being dry. We do our best to try to liven it up, but unfortunately, you know, when you're talking about financial management of a grant, it's a little difficult. Whoops, sorry about that. All righty.
Okay, so again, this is Kim. While she's on the phone, most of you all know who we are. We're a program of the Maine Forest Service under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Our funding is through the 1990 Farm Bill, and we're very grateful for that. And that is renewed every biennium through the U.S. government through their budget. It looks like Jan, you're back on.
Yeah, so Kim, I heard you saying, you know, that we're funded through the Farm Bill. Project Canopy, our main objective is to help towns and communities throughout the state of Maine to develop and maintain those long-term community forestry programs that are going to benefit our communities for decades and centuries to come. We do that through a variety of means. You all are familiar already that we offer financial incentives to help communities get a start and to continue that work. But we do also have technical assistance. Kim's available to provide technical assistance. We also have our 10 district foresters located throughout the state. They're very familiar with the communities and the work that you're doing. And I highly encourage you to engage with them in your projects. They often are some of the folks that will get out and help you plant the trees when you have a big volunteer day. Sometimes they'll even help you drum up the volunteer support. So our district foresters are really fantastic people, and definitely should be on your contact list for somebody that you should talk to before you submit the grant. And then we also offer various educational programs. Kim, I think, already went into that, doing different trainings, everything from how to plant a tree and prune trees to how to conduct street tree inventories, and more in-depth management planning for your community tree and forest resources. So lots of help out there from the Maine Forest Service, and I would add that it is all free. These are things that you've paid for in your tax dollars, and it's like a prepaid. So take advantage of it. Okay, I actually did that slide. Never mind. So how much do we have? This year we have 100,000 roughly available. That's fairly consistent with what we've had in the last several years. I would say, based on the interest this year, I believe it is going to be relatively competitive. In a typical year, we do have an oversubscription of the funds that we have available, but it's not usually overwhelming. And I say that because I don't want to discourage anybody from applying. It's usually a fairly high rate of success with these grants. And, we do our best to award as many projects as possible. And that will include, in some cases, if there are small items that we find are either over typical costs, or maybe things that slipped in there that aren't eligible, we will work to reduce your award, but to still give you some of your award to support your project. The grants are available in two categories. That's the planting and maintenance grant category, where we have up to $8,000 available, maximum reimbursement, and then the planning and education awards up to $10,000. And that grant program focuses more on that sustainable urban and community forestry program development and management for the long term, to help you to increase the awareness of the benefit of trees within your communities. Some of the basics, and Marlene will talk about this in a fair bit more depth. Eligible entities, and I know I've got a couple folks on the line that are some of these quasi governmental or quasi nonprofit groups that we may have to work out some kinks with, but normally state and local units of government, nonprofit organizations like land trusts or nonprofit conservation commissions, educational institutions, again, university level right down through, elementary schools, and even, private educational institutions are eligible to apply for this funding. These are 50-50 matching grants. And what that means is that, say you apply for an $8,000 planting grant and you receive that $8,000 award. What you are then, that $8,000 is paying for 50% of what your total project costs. You will then match that grant with another $8,000 of either cash, in-kind donations, in-kind labor, any of that sort of stuff. So your total project cost is actually $16,000, and we're paying for 50% of it. So that's where that 50-50 number comes in. Lots of folks get confused by that. It's a signed agreement. Once you have the agreement signed from the Maine Forest Service, that then goes out to you for countersignature, and that's when you can begin your work. The planting grants are a 12-month timeline or thereabouts. If grant awards go out with the suggested timeline that we have, which is starting in May, those grants will, you'll be able to initiate your work about mid-May, and they will run through June 30th of 2022. So you'll get a little bit more than 12 months and potentially a couple of different planting windows. With the planning and education grants, those are an 18-month timeline. So those will expire in 22 as well, October 30th of 22. And then these are reimbursement-based grants. So what happens with that is once you are awarded the grant, you are reimbursed for satisfactory work completed within the grant period as described within the original scope of work. The grant funds are not provided up front. If you are familiar with working with foundations or some other types of grants, you might be more familiar with getting your money up front. We are not able to do that with these federal funds. So final receipts for reimbursement must be submitted along with verification of matching expenses and in-kind services in order to request that reimbursement after the project is completed. And I believe Kim went over this a little bit on that first slide, but the grant funds are primarily from the USDA Forest Service, from the Community Forestry Program. And the USDA Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program was originally authorized by the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act of 1978 and revised by the 1990 Farm Bill to promote natural resource management in the places where we live. And that program is designed to recognize the importance of trees in improving our quality of life. So that is the majority of the funds. We do have some additional funds that help round out this program, and several of our planting grants will actually be supported through funds that we collect at the state level related to enforcement action. And then in some cases, particularly for folks in southern Maine, Cumberland, York County, and then in far northern Maine who are dealing with the emerald ash borer infestation and maybe doing planning or response or planting for the future to mitigate the damage from emerald ash borer, you may be supported through additional grant funds that we have received to work specifically on that issue. And then again, the purpose of these grants is to support community efforts to develop and maintain long-term community forestry programs by raising public awareness of the benefits and values of trees, to develop and maintain partnerships that are going to support the ongoing management of those trees, to promote comprehensive natural resource management, and that may be resource management of your street and park trees. It may also be management of your community forest and public forest resources, places like your town forests. And then lastly, to increase the number of actively managing communities, and I will go into that in a little more detail. So actively managing communities, this is because this is a federally supported program, the state has requirements that we have to report on in order to receive our federal award, and that is defined by how many actively managing communities we have in the state. And those actively managing communities are those folks who have what is called professional staff. That can be a town forester, a town arborist. It could be somebody held under contract to provide those services. It can be a tree warden who's in a volunteer position, you name it. But anybody who is dedicated in your community to provide some level of resource management for your community forest resources. Actively managing communities also would have some sort of advocacy group. Oftentimes that comes in the form of a tree board or a conservation commission. It can be as small or as large as the community needs. Tree ordinances and policies, or local tree policies, are also considered something that is a characteristic of an actively managing community. A tree inventory, and then with that inventory, an up-to-date community forest management plan. So within your grant packet, you have one sheet where you'll check the boxes off according to this, and this helps us with our reporting to the federal government, basically on an annual basis. And the more actively managing communities that we have going forward, the potential is that we would get more money than from the federal government in order to supply more grants. So it's a win-win. Timeline this year, the announcement went out at the beginning of January. The materials have been up on the website since then. They haven't changed much, so hopefully you've taken some time to download those and take a look at the grant applications and the guidelines. We're doing the workshop here today. Applications are due in a little over a month, March 12th, and we will need to have those electronically by the close of business on March 12th. And then again, anticipated grant awards. I tried to give ourselves a fair bit of time. It's possible that we could have that turned around a little bit sooner and have that all the contractual materials done in April, but I'm pushing it out just to give ourselves time, not knowing what's going to happen. So we're saying the middle of May, and then we will need to get those signed contracts back before any work can begin. So next section of the agenda, the grant applications and the two different grant categories. I'm going to go into a little bit here before I hand it over to Marlene. Again, we have the two different grant categories, planting and maintenance and planting and education. Planting and maintenance is the more basic of the two grant categories. It's geared towards applicants that are just getting started in managing their community tree resources. These grants provide an excellent opportunity for communities to increase tree cover, to improve tree health, to engage citizens at the local level, and build support for your community tree program. Some examples of types of projects include tree planting in high visibility areas where they make a direct and positive impact on your community, buffer plantings to filter air or water, limit stormwater runoff and stabilize soils, and business district enhancements. We've been getting a lot of business district enhancement projects in the last few years, as I think one of the programs that we ran previously was the Small Business Administration tree planting program, which put a lot of trees in our downtowns. And I think a lot of those trees are finally reaching the ends of their lives. And we're seeing a lot of projects now to replace those trees that were originally funded in the early 90s. And then the second grant category, planning and education grants, support projects that develop and maintain managed long-term community forestry programs, including doing things like street tree inventory, long-term planning, tree board and tree ordinance development, forest management planning for publicly owned or accessible parcels in accordance with our Maine Forest Service Woods-Wise standards. And if you are doing any forest management, I encourage you to reach out again to me, to Kim, or to your district forester to get hold of those standards before you engage with hiring any foresters or anything like that. The planning and education grant category is much more flexible. We see a lot of different types of projects within that category, and it can encompass a lot of different things. So if your project is not just straightforward tree planting and maintenance, it's probably going to be in the planning and education grant category. The application forms, again, they're all available on the website, fillable PDFs, and this here is the first page of the planning and education grant. And you just need to make sure that you're complete and accurate when you fill these things out. We want to know at the top here, let's see, do I have a pointer? So, yeah, this top section here, you're just giving us your basic community or organizational information. Again, just be complete. Make sure you give us your email address, your federal ID number, and appropriate way to get in contact with you. That's all we're going to have with how to contact you. And also, I would say, you know, if you're designating your grant to another organization within your community, you want to make sure that that's well identified here and how to contact that person as well. In the middle here is your summary budget information. These numbers are going to match those on page 5 of your application at the end of the application. You're then going to just give us a short title to your project and then a brief abstract of your project. This is not where you go into complete detail of your program, just a quick snapshot. And I'm going to flip back and forth between the two different grant categories here, just so you're looking at the same things. This is page 1 of the tree planting and maintenance grant. Again, you have that basic information up here at the top, all the same stuff, short project title, but you're not going to provide us an abstract on the planting and maintenance grant. Again, this is a much more concise application, more geared towards folks who are just getting started with our program or developing something locally. So we've tried to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible. Page 2 of both applications are the same. You've got a summary of the additional items that you're going to include in your application packet, including your forms, your narrative, and I'll go into that, a 3-year maintenance plan for any tree planting, and both categories allow for tree planting. So that doesn't mean that you would only apply or submit a 3-year maintenance plan for the planting grants. If you have any tree planting in your planning and education grant, you would also supply us with a maintenance plan for those trees. You want to provide us with project maps, photos, any sort of supporting documentation that's going to help tell that story that you've told in the narrative, and then letters of support. You want to make sure that you, as the applicant, have signed, and then also the designated or official representative of your organization. So if you're in a municipality, that might be your first selectman or your town manager. Nonprofit, you're going to want to have your director provide that signature. This is the person who has the fiduciary responsibility and is able to sign off on grant applications. And then again, you want to send those applications to me directly, jansantera@maine.gov, no later than 5 p.m. on March 12th. We don't put too many other sidebars on that. We can actually accept messages that are a little bit larger than the 10 megabytes, but you don't want to go crazy. I don't need 50 pages of photos in these applications. Just enough, again, to tell that story. So the planning and education grant, again, more in depth. The budget is much longer, and you have more different categories that you can submit your costs into. So the first page of the budget in the planning and education grant is for consultants and services to your project, educational and promotional supplies, and then again, you can include things like tree purchase, planting, and maintenance in this grant as well. So you've got that category listed here. You have 7 different categories for expenses within the planning and education grant. And then column A is for your reimbursable expenses, those expenses that you're requesting that the Maine Forest Service would reimburse you for. Column B is for your local share. It may be, donated trees. It may be that you're just paying for half of the price of those services or those items. But that's for your local share, and then the total over here in column C. And it's worth noting here that you don't have to match item for item either. You don't have to, you can put all of your costs up front in consultants and promotional supplies, trees, and then everything else, if you're providing, primarily in kind as your match, can be on page 2 of your budget. Items 4, 5, and 6, administrative costs, volunteer labor, machinery and equipment, and donated materials are all not eligible for reimbursement. So you can lump all of your local match over here on this page if that's what you need to do. I will say a lot of folks get into this thinking that they're going to have a hard time coming up with that 50% cost share. And once you start thinking about how much time and materials go into these projects, you'll often find that you have far and overmatched any potential expenses. So don't let your potential costs discourage you. And we've provided a few different links here on this slide for how to evaluate potential rates. If you're not familiar with doing grants in the past, this may be new to you, but we want you to use established rates for everything that you possibly can. And if you're, again, a town and you have a town laborer that's providing time, then they're going to have an established rate that they receive as pay. That's typically pretty easy to figure out. But for volunteers, that can be a little bit more difficult. If you have a volunteer board that's providing time and services, you can look up rates through the independent sector, potentially through the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Maine Department of Labor, to get a sense of what those rates might be. I will say that the typical or the accepted volunteer rate, I think nationally right now, is around $20 an hour. So you want to be reasonable with the rates that you assess to your volunteers. If you have a volunteer that's providing their professional service, say you've got an attorney that is helping you to craft a local tree ordinance, clearly you're going to use what their attorney's rate would be if they were getting paid for such a service. If that same attorney is helping you to plant trees, then you're going to use the tree planting rate. And hopefully that's fairly straightforward. And then lastly, here on the third page of your budget is anything else. Lots of times what we'll see in the other cost category for projects is things like any building materials you might have. Maybe you're building a kiosk or a signboard for either your town hall or maybe for your town forest. This is where you would put those smaller items that help you to complete that project. And then you want to total up everything in column A. column B, column C, and then those are going to be the numbers that match the numbers that's on the cover page of your application. And again, for planning and education, the total allowable reimbursement is $10,000. For planting and maintenance, again, try to keep it simple, much more straightforward. Your budget is all right here on the cover page. On the left-hand side is those items that you're requesting for reimbursement from the Maine Forest Service. And then on the right-hand side is your local match. And it's pretty well specific to tree purchase, tree planting costs, and the materials associated with planting. And then you can include, again, things like volunteer labor and maintenance of those trees or existing trees within your community. Marlene will talk again about the narrative too in her piece, but this is, the forms are important because it gets the basic information, the contact information, and your budgetary information. But this is really where you want to put the majority of your effort in, is into your narrative. It's your chance to tell your story, and it's essentially, you should look at it as your sales pitch. If you would like, you can give us a brief history of your community or your organization's efforts in community forestry, including your missions and goals. You want to give us a full description of your project, including what you expect to be developed, produced, performed, or implemented, a clear and measurable work plan, and a timeline for completion of the process. In the program guidelines, the grant application guidelines, you will find that we have listed in there our state and national goals for our program. And it's important in your narrative to address how your project is going to help us achieve those goals at a state and national level as well. And then lastly, how this project is going to enhance your community's capacity for long-term community and community tree and forest management. And then I just note on there, you know, it's easy to get carried away with over-promising. After having done this for 20 years, it's pretty easy for us to see where you're biting off more than you ought to. I definitely encourage you to be reasonable and not to commit to doing too much without the local capacity to do so. Again, if you're doing anything on the ground, which most of these projects do have an on the ground component, we would like to see a map and a plan. If you're doing work on a town forest, we'd like to know where that town forest is within your community. If you're doing planting, you know, a map of the trees and the streets where they will be planted, a community park. Again, you know, site plan, landscape plan, if you have any of those types of things that have already been developed. And photographs, of course, help to tell that story. So certainly feel free to include photographs within your application. And we do ask for a 3-year maintenance plan for any planting. Things that you want to identify in a maintenance plan are things like who's watering, how often are trees going to be watered, how much, and if you know what resources you have to do that. Do you have a town watering truck, or are you using, you know, just the adjacent neighbors? If you're using adjacent neighbors, do you have like a watering agreement or something like that? It is important to note, though, that again, local share can only be that which is during the grant contract period. So while we ask for a 3-year maintenance plan, only the costs that are during that grant contract period are eligible to include as part of your match. You can't project out what your costs are going to be in years 2 and 3 and include that as your match, unfortunately. It's just part of the expectation. And then again, if you are using other individuals other than yourselves or your town staff, you've got a crew of scouts, or you're using the homeowners where the trees have been planted to water those trees, it's great if you can include a letter of support from those folks indicating that that is their responsibility and how much time they project that it will take them, and that will count towards your in-kind. And we'd like to see letters of support that indicate a broad range of support for your project. You know, we'd like to see that projects locally have a groundswell of support. We don't want to do projects in places where people don't want trees. And applications should include letters of support from partnering organizations or individuals, rather than general letters of support. Oftentimes we do get general letters from, you know, your local representatives, or sometimes even from our U.S. delegation, which are wonderful. And truly, we do love to see that our delegation does support our programs. We like to see those letters as specific commitments and contributions to your project, rather than just being general. And within those letters, we like to see specifics such as the projected amount of labor that will be committed, services that are provided, donated equipment, labor, or supplies. And then again, in that application, we do include that checklist that goes back to the actively managing communities that we report on to the federal government. If you could just check off those items that you already have. And if you don't already have them, that's not a problem. If it's something that you're working towards, I certainly would love to see that indicated. And even if things like professional staff, if you have professional staff and you want to identify who that person is and provide us with contact information, that helps us to do follow-up surveys and monitoring for these grants as well. So. And then lastly, before I hand it over to Marlene, again, you want to make sure you make that deadline of March 12th. I'm pretty tough on that. Not so tough on the back end. If you do receive a grant, you know, we can be flexible with contract end dates, but it's not something I typically do, taking grant applications past the deadline. It is electronic submission. I do not want to receive any paper applications. We encourage you to do your homework. Make sure you involve the community and proper authorities within your community when you're applying. Call us with any questions. We're happy to try to answer specific questions as much as possible. I will say Kim and I have to step back to some extent because we do evaluate these proposals. So we try not to get too personally involved. It's hard because we love our jobs. But sometimes project-specific questions are better directed towards your local district forester, because typically we only have 1 or 2 of them that help us with the evaluation. So I think that's it for me.
Dan, do you want to answer a question or two before we hand it to Marlene, or do we want to
Sure.
wait till the end?
Sure. Well, and I've got these transition slides, because again, these are all very text heavy slides, and I very much apologize. So yeah, can you read them off to me, Kim?
Yeah, and it's basically one question that I think that you might be able to handle a little better. Sean DeWitt posed about giving the overall demand for funds. Is it is it discouraged to apply to both categories? And he says that there's actually planting in one geographic area and then longer term planning in a wholly different area. So rather than it be one project doing, both planting and planning, it's two separate projects, it looks like to me. And Sean can jump in if that's not right. But do we encourage groups to submit two projects?
I will definitely tackle that. That's the question that we get frequently. It's something you can do. I will say that. And historically, I believe there have been cases where we have funded two projects in separate categories within the same organization or community in 1 year. That said, though, historically, those would have been in years where the competition was lighter. I believe, as I said at the beginning, I think the competition this year is going to be a little bit tighter, given the number of folks that have chosen to participate in the training. And then, for those of you that are not aware, organizations and communities that have participated in the last several years don't have to do this. If you want to apply again next year, you don't have to come back to this training. So, there's lots and lots of other organizations that are also eligible, and many communities come back year after year to request funding. So what I typically ask with an organization that wants to submit two totally separate grants in different categories in the same year is that you prioritize those. If one of them is clearly something that is building towards the next, then you would obviously want to prioritize that for funding. And then if they're unrelated, if you, again, could prioritize that, because it's unlikely that we'll fund two projects within one community, because we definitely want to spread out the amount of support that we're providing to a variety of different organizations across the state.
And I think the only other questions really are in terms of in-kind contributions, which I think Marlene might get into a little bit more during her part.
Yeah, and we can answer those at the end as well.
One other quick question, a practical question from Patrick, says that what's the cost of a tree? I'll let you go into that.
Yeah, I generally say the cost of a tree and planting, you want to include labor in that, is $500. That's a general round figure that I give. It depends on the type of tree. It depends on the size of the tree. But when you're doing projects like these, when you're planting in busy areas or areas that receive a lot of use, you don't want to be planting little whip-sized trees. You want to plant something that is a size that's not going to get mowed over or plowed over generally. So you want to be looking at 1.5 to 2 inch caliper trees, and typically a 2 inch caliper tree I would say is going to run about $500 for purchase and planting and the materials that go with them. That's probably a little bit on the high side for some of you, but it's a good general number. So before I hand it over to Marlene, I'm going to give you some pretty pictures of why we're here and why we're doing this. Before we get into those do's and don'ts, the responsibilities, the financial management of these grants, which can be a little daunting, I just want to remind you and ourselves that we offer this program because we want to plant and grow the urban forest. So trees like this little yellow birch here in the foreground can become this beautiful sugar maple in the background, or the next generation of pin oaks our state oak, pin oak champion that's located in Deering Oaks. 200-year-old trees. These things are going to last far longer than we are. So we're planting these trees not for us necessarily, but for the next generation. We're also helping you to develop community natural areas and town forests for recreation, for wildlife habitat, to improve and maintain water quality, and to provide some capacity locally, potentially for timber harvesting. That's something we certainly advocate, to have managed town forests that are providing revenue. And we want to keep our community woodlands actively managed and open to the public. We want to teach about the value and the importance of these resources to everyone that we interact with. And we rely on you locally to provide them. And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, these projects are about fostering relationships and encouraging participation in the care of our natural resources and our communities and across the landscape. So, working with kids oftentimes is something that we do, and we're hopefully planting the seed for a lifetime of stewardship with these folks. So we have, those volunteers like Wade up here who have dedicated their life to planting trees in our communities. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, Marlene.
Great, thank you, Jan. All right, I will be covering the grant rules of the road, basically just to make you familiar about all of the rules that you need to know about grants. So these are some of the topics we're going to cover. Umbrellas of authority, the financial management system, match documentation, audits, your grant file, which should have the details captured as you collect information so it's all in one place. Grant modifications, any procurement and reporting and monitoring. Okay, next slide. Jan, are you still monitoring the slides? Oh, thanks. So what do you need to know? There's a lot of details we'll be covering, mostly to make sure you're aware of the requirements and understand what your grant can be used for. Make sure you understand the deadlines, record keeping requirements, match requirements, some of which Jan already covered, but I'll go into a little bit more details, just so you can understand what key things to pay attention to and not have any issues with any of your grant funds. Next slide. Just some keywords related to grants. Be mentioning some of these. Transparency, you just want to be upfront with all of your work and expenses related to the grant. We'll go more into internal controls, all your performance and monitoring of your grant, and making sure that whatever you're doing with your grant funds is reasonable, allowable, and you're not wasting or abusing funds. You just want to make sure that the funds go to what your application included and what you said you were going to do with those funds. Next slide. These are just some acronyms. I won't go over them, but they're here in case you see them in any of those websites you go to or on the form. They just kind of spell out some of what those acronyms are. These are the umbrellas of authority. We follow the federal law. We get our funds from the U.S. Forest Service, but we also have to follow our state rules as well. These funds are under the Cooperative Forestry Assistance, Urban and Community Forest. A couple other laws there. All right, next slide. This is just the circular information with the link as the website for if you wanted to do more detailed looking at what those requirements are. Mostly they're all just guidelines to make sure that you're following the rules of grants. Next slide. These are some of the things covered. They cover administrative requirements, the cost principles, and single audit requirements. So more details. And the way that that is organized is through these different subparts. B through D are really the requirements of the grant that I'll go over to make sure you have what you need in the applications and are aware of that. And then the other ones are covering as you work your grant and you expend funds, making sure that you're following those rules and keeping the documentation for any possible audits in the future. And these, in the cost principles, that would determine what the allowable costs are, which we'll go into a little more in a little bit, just to make sure you're spending the funds for your grant for specifically that project and not in other areas. And then the other thing will be to make sure everything is consistent. How is it organized? Oh, that's, conflicts of interest.
Sorry, Marlene, I got ahead of you.
Yeah. Okay. If there's any conflict of interest, that must be disclosed in writing up front, just to make sure that that has been captured and you avoid anything around that. It could be somebody that is working with you on the grant, or maybe you just find ways to not have that happen so that it doesn't look like there's favoritism for someone you know or something like that. So it's pretty self-explanatory. But if there's any question of it as you're working your grant, you can always call us with questions. All right, this is basically a financial capability checklist. This should help you to get an understanding of your minimum requirements needed to manage the federal funds. Also, it should cover some of your agency's accounting systems and policies. There is a handout that should be on the website that you can look at as well. It's just covering that your organization has financial stability and has a history of being organized and having staff and finances. So, all right, next slide. This is more on the post-award, talking about financial management, tracking performance and of your grant and program activities, tracking financial expenses, income, or any details, payments, or it could include the match, any match that's associated, getting all that documented, and then making sure that those are within the period of performance of that signed grant document. So that's just an outline of all the different parts, and I'll probably go into just about all of them here in the next few slides. Okay, financial management systems. As grantees, you'll be responsible to make sure everything is current and accurate in tracking your grant activities. You'll need to record or identify any other sources of funds to make sure they're not from another federal source. We just don't want to use federal money to match any federal money or anything like that. If you have any sub-grant awards, then you'll want to make sure that's documented and tracked. And you want to make sure that funds are used according to all these federal rules and for basically what was in your grant application, so that all of the expenses and documentation matches the application. That's generally what they would look for in an audit. Or did you follow the rules of your organization in processing any invoices or other financial documents? So in an audit, you would just want to be able to show the details of how those funds were spent. So that's why it's important to keep the documentation. Next slide. Seven primary characteristics. I already mentioned identifying the funds, and then having a way to show your financial expenses. And it's important that your organization have some type of control and accountability of those funds. Most of it's electronic these days. Some have a database. But if you're a smaller organization, maybe it's some spreadsheets showing you're documenting each invoice, showing you're tracking everything. And then it's important to also follow any of your written procedures for your organization. Adequate accounting system requirements would include those internal controls so that it's not just one person that's in charge of everything. It's important to make sure that there's a segregation of duties. Maybe you have a finance person that signs off on invoices, and maybe somebody else reviews and signs off that work was done, or somebody else is has the authority to sign for the grant, so that we have checks and balances. And if you have any documentation of how you track different expenses or grants, that's good to also pay attention to. And just make sure, again, that those costs that are charged to the grant are applicable to what you applied for in the grant. You just want to leave the clear audit trail. So all federal awards received must be identified. And the best way to do that is to make sure you're tracking the federal award identification number and year of that award. Maybe you got an award last year and it's the same project name, but if you have a different fiscal year signed and a different award number, then you'll be able to track those separately. Or maybe it's from another federal grant. Either way, you want to track that very separately and not mix up any grant funds. So it's helpful to put those numbers on any of the documentation that you have for maybe every invoice or your reimbursement or any other documentation you have in your grant file. And this is a tracking spreadsheet sample. Maybe you already have one similar. I think this is available as a handout to use if you don't have one. But basically it just captures some of those details I was talking about. Maybe it could be who you're paying, the date, what the activity was for, how much it costs. And then you could even on this sheet track, is this going to be for reimbursement or will this be tracked as match? So this is a good summary of all of your expenses And then you would want to keep the individual ones as well. And this is one all filled out, so you can see how that looks. If you do have multiple grants, or maybe you have a grant from last year that isn't finished and then you're applying for a new one, you would want to track them separately with different grant codes, maybe have a different spreadsheet for each, just to keep that separation of those federal grant funds. These are some other samples of timesheets for volunteers, salaried employees, donated equipment. You want to use the fair market value for any type of donation, what it would cost if you did actually need to rent a piece of equipment. So those should be included in those links that were provided. And I think these sample forms should also be available should you need to use any of those. But if you have something similar already that captures this data, that should work. Just important to capture it. Allowable costs, they need to be necessary to execute your grant, reasonable, allocable, and consistent. So you don't want to shift funds somewhere else that you would have normally spent in an area just because of federal money. So you should plan for that up front, so you're not looking like you're shifting money around to take advantage of federal, to abuse federal funds. And again, written procedures are required and should be followed for any financial things that you process, any invoicing. That's basically what they look for in audits, is making sure that you follow your agency's policies. And if you don't have one written, maybe just get something written of what you do, and then it will be captured. Unallowable costs would be costs that are not related to your grant, costs incurred outside of that grant period, including match. So any of your costs for your grant would need to be within, once your grant's approved and signed, and then whether it's the 12 or 18 months. Others, maybe you didn't adequately document something and it's hard to say, is this really related to the grant? Or maybe it's outside of what was included in your grant narrative and description of what you had planned to do. And also, maybe you're spending too much federal dollars without providing enough match. So that's important. As Jan had mentioned earlier, it doesn't have to be in the same category, but the total match should be there for your total expense. It's also important to have internal controls, just to make sure you have those checks and balances, that there's segregation of duties, people doing different roles, so no one's taking advantage of anything. And again, following all of your agency's written policies for everything from timesheets to travel to purchases. And then also you want to treat any PII according to those rules as well. Also, it's a good idea not to pre-sign checks. I'm not sure many people do that, but just to mention it. Some, I don't know if all agencies require this, but usually for over a certain amount, it's common to get 2 signatures to get approval on an expense. Good idea not to use stamps, because then you don't really know who reviewed it, who took responsibility for approving that expense. And then you should make sure that the supporting documentation is there in processing any payments. And then also segregation of duty. Finance director may not want to also be a check signer. So these internal controls are to help managers to be effective and efficient and just avoid problems like overspending or violating any of those financial rules, and will help protect your grant funds and help you meet your obligations. All right. Match must be verifiable. So you should have a file that keeps track of your match documentation and getting those forms filled out to show what it would cost, track the hours, the dates used, or if it's volunteer hours, what days they work, that type of thing. Again, federal grants cannot be used as match, so if you have any other federal funds, that won't be allowed to be used as match. Program income also cannot be used as match without prior approval. And then for in-kind, as long as that's documented and you get those details of what the values are for those and within those timeframes of that grant. As Jan mentioned at the beginning, for this program, for the Project Canopy, it's a 50-50 match. So whatever you're applying for the federal funds through the Maine Forest Service, you would have to match that same amount. Your total project cost will include a federal share along with the match. And then you should also make sure you identify your sources of match in your application budget. And all of the match should also be necessary and reasonable to accomplish. So it should all be related. There may be volunteers and use of equipment. Maybe it's the office expenses that are used to get your grant accomplished. You just want to make sure it's all related to the grant. For donated services, you can look at the Bureau of Labor Standards, or look at your, within your local community, what would it cost for somebody to do that similar work? And Jen had covered this earlier as well. This grant doesn't usually cover donated property, but it does mention it's the value assessed to the donated property at the time of the donation. Then if you can also receive cash for donation if you have some contributions to your organization, that can also be listed. More on in-kind, again, needs to be necessary, related to the grant, allowable, and then needs to be documented so we can verify it in your records if we ever needed to. Program income. You are encouraged to earn program income to defray the program costs, but that should be discussed before the grant's approved. It would require prior written approval. It would also affect how the grant is reported, because if you're reporting program income, that could possibly mean you wouldn't need as much federal funding. So, those funds can also not be from taxes, fines, or penalties. So usually we don't see this used too much. More common are your direct expenses used as match or the in-kind. So, but if there are any questions on program income, we could cover that later. It's just not typical.
Yeah, I'll just add a little, Marlene, there, but some potential sources of program income would be, if you were to hold a workshop and you were to charge a fee for that workshop, that would be considered program income and could go to cover your in-kind, or your local cost share if you don't get pre-approval, but if not, then it would end up reducing the cost of your award. Another one that we do often see would be if you are developing a forest management plan for a publicly owned forested parcel, and within the time frame of the grant, you're also considering conducting active timber harvesting and the sale of timber. That would be potential program income. And I typically try to discourage that and wait till the grant contract is over before you engage in any timber harvesting that you're going to receive revenue from.
Very good points, Jan. Thank you for adding all that. As far as audits, you're responsible for obtaining audits, Single Audit Act. 750,000 is the fiscal year expenditure threshold. There's a website there, should you need to look at that. What do they look for in audits? That your grant expenses were allowable under what you had applied for, that they're reasonable within the grant term, that you're not charging expenses to another federal program, that you're keeping the cost consistent with your grant, and that you're consistent, and that you have your documentation. So that's pretty much the same thing I had mentioned earlier. These are the lists of things that are good to keep in your grant file. It could be your grant award, your application, your any documentation on authority to spend, your written policies related to your grant, all your expenditures and invoices, any match or those documented in-kind forms. Maybe your organization produces some financial reports that can sort out your grant-specific expenses. And then at the end, any of your final reports, maybe even your reimbursement of funds. So those are all good things to keep in your file, and it also makes it easy for, if there was an audit, you could just pull that information. And if it's not a hard copy, it can be electronic, and then you could just produce it when needed. It's also good to keep separate grant files for each different grant you get, whether it's a different type of grant from another program or your grant from year to year. That way it's all contained together for that one grant award. And this is just one suggested grant format that we use at the Maine Forest Service, but it can be something similar. Maybe you already have one, just kind of keeping some like documents together, the application and the expenses and the end report. The narrative statement, your sales pitch. Jan went into more detail about this, but you're basically explaining your goals and objectives, what you plan to accomplish, what do you want to do with those funds. You're going to describe how you're going to get that done, to include your activities, timeline, who's going to help you get it done, as well as your monitoring and evaluation. And then there's the budget as well. So no equipment over 5,000, that isn't allowed in this program, but your budget details on how you plan to spend the grant funds is very important. Equipment is considered any tangible property that has a useful life over 1 year. A lot of times it's a cost of over 5,000. Again, not authorized under this project. Here's some details on the standards for documenting your work performed. They should include, the different details that you're getting done, reflect your federal and non-federal activities. Kind of covered most of this. Just tracking different grant expenses, showing your match, anything related to your grant. There are times when you might need to revise your budget. Funds can be moved within your approved budget categories, but does require prior written approval from the Maine Forest Service, because maybe something happened that was not anticipated, or something changed along the way. So if that's the case, then you would send Jan that request. Again, you'd want to ask first, not spend before, because we understand the programs and budgets are your best estimate and changes can happen. So prior approval is usually required. And the prior approvals could be for changes in your scope of work, or what you had for your goals and objectives. Maybe something happened that to the land area you were working in, or something fell through and you need to make that change, or maybe there's a new person involved that you want to get updated on your grant form. Changes in subcontracting, or now somebody else is going to do some of the activities, so it's not quite what you said in your grant application. All of these changes would need to be requested prior to your end date of your grant. Changes can happen for the budget between different budget categories. Maybe you thought you'd spend more in personnel hours, but now you need to spend more in materials or supplies, so that's one option. Or maybe you have more admin costs, or a change in your match. Maybe the match is coming from somewhere else. Anything over 10% in each category of your 10% of the overall total grant award is what would require a written approval to change your budget. Grant revisions and extensions, again, pre-approval, still need to meet your objectives and goals that you had applied for in your grant. They must all be allowable costs, and then strong justification as well. For anything you want to change, basically you have to spell out what changed and why, and what is it you want to change it to. All those details will help in getting that reviewed for approval. Procurement, you just want to go ahead and use your own agency written purchasing procedures. Usually it should reflect any state and local laws that also support the federal laws. The things that you purchase with any grant funds or as match should be necessary for the grant. Competitive process is usually better. If you're using some kind of sole source, it's usually for emergencies. That way you're being fair and equitable to the different vendors out there. And it all should be documented whenever you make any of those purchases, and any written conflict of interest policy. competition should be conducted in a manner to provide the full open competition, especially for any of those small purchases under 3,000. That way you're being fair and equitable to the vendors. Sole source is usually discouraged, but occasionally might be needed if it's an emergency or something rare and unique that only a certain vendor may have. Grantees are responsible for managing your grant and any sub-grants, supporting your programs. And you should also make sure that you're compliant with any federal reporting requirements and achievement of your goals. And then submit any reports when they're due. And then for this grant, you'll be spending upfront, requesting reimbursement, and usually there's some reports that follow as well. So you just want to pay attention to those, make sure you're on track. This is a sample certification statement. Every annual fiscal report, final report voucher should state the following: signed by an official authorized to sign legally. It's just certifying that you have expended those grant funds in the proper manner. Financial monitoring. You'll want supporting documentation for all of your expenditures, which would include invoices and receipts, purchase orders, any contracts. Maybe you had some travel costs, any timesheets, any payrolls, anything, any type of expense related to your grant, and as well as those in-kind documentation reports. You want to follow your local or state written procurement policies using your, the specs, bids, sole source justification, just for emergencies or uniqueness, make sure that's documented. And track the details on anything that supports the grant. Monitoring your subrecipients and contractors includes making sure they're also complying with the grant process and all the grant requirements. That can be done with some site visits, phone calls. Maybe you meet face to face, or it could be on a Zoom or Teams or something like that, or maybe you conduct some training to make sure they're also aware of the requirements of the grant. You might ask for some written progress reports, news stories, and verify that what they're doing is within that same grant period. This will also provide benefits such as maybe some technical assistance. You can showcase success, ensure your project's on track, even improve your communication, or just know about any shortfalls coming up, or knowing how to make those adjustments to still meet your grant project goals and objectives. Fiscal matters, things to be cautious about: supplantation, caution to not divert budgeted funds for a specific project to other expenses once you receive your approved grant. So you must complete your project as planned in your grant description. Consultants, you want to use fair market value. and be careful on sole sourcing. Program income, we kind of covered it already, where Jan mentioned the prior approval is really important. Once before the grant award, once it's awarded, it could reduce your grant amount if you've got program income coming in to offset it. Match, ensure that your match amount is met. If you're struggling with that, sometimes it means that you just request less federal reimbursement. As long as you're meeting that 50-50 match, then you should be all set. And then make sure that you're keeping your records in your grant file. I'm not so sure the excessive spending is as critical for these grants because you're spending a lot of it up front and then reimbursing at the end. But in some grants, that is something to be cautious about. Retention, all your grant records must be retained for 3 years after the close of the grant period. So the date of submission of the final expenditure report. So that would apply to all of your grant records, anything in that grant file. So 3 years at the very end. This is the civil rights and credit prohibiting discrimination. There's a website there and the form is available to download.
Just a reminder to make sure that that goes out on any publications, signage, anything like that that you do, and to provide credit for the grant funds.
Thanks, Jan. So things we're looking for in your grant project. We're looking at your project goals and or at least comparing your expenses in the end with your project goals, supports your approved initiatives and investments. So all your expenses should match all of your initiatives and goals. Also the budget and narrative, make sure all that matches and supports all of your grant objectives. All of your expenses should be necessary, reasonable, appropriate, and that you review prior to subrecipient performance. What next? The slideshow will be available online, and there's Jan's email and phone number. My email's there too if there's any questions on the grant financial part or tracking, documentation, that type of thing. And these are the web resources for some of those, the circulars, USDA requirements, Code of Federal Regulations. That's where some of these requirements come from. But there, if you are interested in checking any of that information. So I believe that concludes my portion. So thank you, and I hope I helped explain enough, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I know it's not the most exciting information, but all important to help manage your grant.
Thanks, Marlene. It is all very important, and like I said at the beginning of this, we feel it's valuable to do this beforehand so everybody knows what they're getting involved with prior to getting the application in and receiving that award. So thanks for Marlene for going through that, and it's it's a lot of gobbledygook as far as federal jargon and different circulars and materials that you could potentially reference, but just know that, we do have folks here that can help to interpret that and guide all of us through it. Marlene's, she helps us guide us through on our own grant management. So, Kim, are you monitoring the chat at all to see if there's any additional questions that I might have missed?
I am. We've had a couple come in. Oh, someone wants to know, where was the photo of the wooded trail with an interpretational panel of logging information?
Yeah, I know the wooded trail was in, I believe, the Bangor City Forest, what is now known as the Roland Perry City Forest, I believe. And then the interpretive panel is at I believe, the Yankee Woodlot in Wells.
Next, is reimbursement usually done at the end of the grant period, or can it take place at the halfway point?
On a rare occasion, I will sometimes do halfway points, but I really discourage that. I much prefer to wait until the end. If you absolutely need to do a reimbursement midway through the grant cycle, all of those same requirements are in place. So you would have to demonstrate with all of your paperwork, all of your in-kind contributions, all of your match. If you're not able to do that, then all I'm able to do is to reimburse half of the costs that are documented at that point. I know, this last year has presented so many challenges on so many different levels, and a lot of projects that were to take place in this last year through the grant program had to change course, and I've done a lot of amendments to projects to either shift funds to plant trees elsewhere, or definitely a lot of extensions because communities just weren't able to access people to do the tree planting, and in a lot of cases we have had a shortage of the trees to be planted themselves. The nurseries have had shortages, and we've had issues with moving material across state lines and such. So I've had some projects that have drawn out extensively and have had to do some midway point reimbursements, and that's what I've had to do is, if you've only had, you've paid, say, $10,000 to a nursery, and you're not able to demonstrate any of that match at that point, I'm only able to pay half of that bill. But then at the end, when you can demonstrate all of those costs, then we'll make the full reimbursement up to that halfway point.
If a nonprofit applies, does it need to check with the municipality for compatibility with existing plans?
I would definitely encourage it. I guess I would want to know a little bit more detail into the specifics of what that project was, whether, I would say absolutely yes, or maybe it's not necessary. But it's always good if you're a nonprofit or a school, if you're communicating with the municipality in which you're operating.
This one's going to be interesting. How much does a typical roadside tree weigh?
I have no idea. A ton. Yeah, Kim, you can help me out there.
Oh.
Several hundred pounds. I mean, usually it takes several able-bodied people to move a 2-inch caliper balled and burlap tree around. It's a lot of work. So you're not planting roadside trees using 5th graders.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get a hold of a good supplier for bare root trees, those are much easier to get in, but it's harder to keep them alive. You have to basically plant them the day that you receive them. So there's some give and take there. But yeah, I'm interested, Ken, why you're asking. They're heavy. Let's see. If anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat.
You can put them in the chat, or if you want to pipe up too, or raise your hand.
You know, I'm noticing that there is a hand raised. So let's see who
that was maybe Merle Parise. Did you have a question?
Yes, I do. I want to get back to the funding source for the program. Or for our project in Newcastle, we've had a timber harvest on this property, and we've set some money aside we can use that money for the matching grant, correct?
Yes. Yeah, you have money set aside already. Yeah.
Yeah, it's already finished. Just what you were talking about is after the fact, or during the project, I guess.
Right. Yes. If you already have money in the bank, I mean, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with using cash to match your project. And if you already have money on hand from a previous timber harvest, or just in your budget, that's certainly the easiest way to match. It requires the least amount of documentation on your part. So.
The project maps, do they need to be ArcView?
No.
More or less?
No.
Or
it
identified?
At the end of the project, if you're developing any plans and mapping is part of that, then yes, I would ask that those we have some polygon information from those, because that goes into our federal reporting. But in the application, the proposal, those do not need to be in ArcView.
And then one more question. Let me see, I had it right here. Up to date on the management plans. What do you mean by up to date management plans?
Yeah, I think the federal guidelines are 5 years, which to me that's over the top. I'm setting a standard of up to date plan being within the last 10 years.
And more or less the tree growth program.
Exactly.
Scenario. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. You all did a great job. Thank you.
Thanks, Merle.
Okay, Will asks, given the democratic nature of many towns' budget process, how often do proposed public matches fall through? Does a town need to have the matching fully budgeted and approved prior to application?
If you're using cash as your match, I would say yes. You certainly have to go through your municipal leadership, those who have fiduciary responsibility for your community, to review these grant proposals. So it should be within that time frame that a town is addressing any potential pitfalls, shortfalls with your budgeting. In the case of the in-kind matching, I don't find that many towns dig too deeply into that happening or not happening. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I've not run into too many problems, very few problems with a town falling through on their match, even when it's been budgeted.
Okay, yeah, it seems that assuming the matching funds were coming from the budget, so.
I think I would say, if there are clear indicators that that is something that is potentially going to happen, that, it's up to the local manager of the grant project to put the brakes on and to communicate with us about what's going on. There's the possibility that if those funds that were budgeted need to be shifted to other projects, or maybe they could be reallocated to the following year, that we can do an extension and try to make sure that the community stays whole as far as any obligations that they've made.
Lisa mentions that our forest management plan is 20 years old. We're hoping to get the grant to update that plan. So it doesn't necessarily fit into the guideline you just mentioned of 5 to 10 years for a plan.
No, but under the grant, you would be working towards updating that. So that makes total sense. And again, when you're filling out that community capacity checklist, we're recording that information for our knowledge, and so that we can put that forward in our federal reporting. If you have none of those characteristics within your community or your organization, it's not going to hurt you in any way.
This is great. We have attendees answering other attendees' questions. But just so everybody can hear, does this program include fruit trees?
Yes, it can. Fruit trees and shrubs as well. Although, we request that the majority of your planting grant not be dedicated towards shrubs. It can include some shrubs. And you can use things like perennials for part of your match, although we will not allow for annual flowers to be included in your match.
Is there a list of the types of trees we should use? And what about hedge or privacy bushes?
We do not have an established list of recommended trees or shrubs. I said it in the chat up above. If you want to call and consult with Kim, myself, or our district foresters, we're definitely happy to talk about trees and plants with you to make sure that you get a good fit. The only things that you are not allowed to plant is anything that's on the main invasive species list, the do not sell list, and then we also include in the do not plant any of the plants that are in near danger from invasive forest pests, and that includes any species of ash trees at this point.
I think the only other here we've got I also saw that being a Tree City USA automatically gives an applicant 10 points in the scoring process. We're a very small town and do not have a tree ordinance and some of the other requirements. Would this penalize us?
That the Tree City USA bonus is only in the planning and education grant. And I will say that oftentimes that kind of balances out with there's another scoring component for a new community. So oftentimes those that are not a Tree City USA are a new community, so they end up getting the points there. It is not a requisite to be a Tree City USA to apply. It does give some bonus points, recognizing that the communities that are Tree City USAs have a long-term established programs and have some sustainability and guaranteed stewardship for those programs. And I will add that we include that in the scoring because it is something that we encourage communities across Maine to participate in. And it doesn't matter how large or how small your community is, you can become a Tree City USA, and you can use these grants to help you achieve those requirements to be a Tree City USA. And you can also work with our staff to help you achieve those requirements to become a Tree City. So. And I should add too that nonprofit organizations, that's not an applicable element for you, so it doesn't hurt or help you.
Do we have sample tree ordinances available?
Yes, we do.
That was easy. Looks like one last question at this point. Someone mentioned earlier in the chat that they had started a community orchard with one of the Project Canopy grants in the past. Can they get funding in this grant period to expand that heritage fruit tree orchard?
Yes.
Okay. If there's anything else, anything that I missed in the chat, I'm raising my own hand. That's not what I need to do. Folks can raise their hands or potentially unmute themselves, but I think that looks like it might be it. And just with a couple extra minutes before 3 o'clock.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for your time. I know it's a slog, but I appreciate your sticking with us, and feel free to reach out. Again, you've got our contact information. If you have any specific questions, we're happy to try to answer those. And I look forward to seeing all of your applications here in another month or so. So go forth and do good things.
Thanks all.